She practiced her voice, not the words, not the argument, not the science, the voice itself. She lowered it deliberately, consciously, the way a performer adjusts before stepping into the light, before the room becomes quiet, before people decide whether to believe what they are about to hear. The voice became part of the product. It was calm. It was deep. It was unnervingly still. And for years, that stillness did something remarkable. It made uncertainty sound like certainty. It made a company without a working revolution sound like the future of medicine. Her name was Elizabeth Holmes. She was 19 years old when she left Stanford. She had no medical degree. She had no completed product. She had no clinical proof that the small device she imagined could do what she promised. But she had an idea so beautiful that people wanted it to be true before anyone proved that it was. A single drop of blood, a small machine, hundreds of tests, fast results, lower prices, no needles, no long waits, no cold laboratory chair under fluorescent lights while a technician searches for a vein. The promise was simple enough for anyone to understand. That was part of its power. Medicine is complicated. Hospitals are complicated. Insurance is complicated. Laboratory testing is complicated. But Theranos offered a story that sounded simple. One drop could tell you everything. For a person afraid of needles, it sounded kind. For a patient waiting for answers, it sounded merciful. For investors, it sounded enormous. For Silicon Valley, it sounded like exactly the sort of impossible thing that a young founder was supposed to make real. The world had already been trained to believe in young founders. It had watched dorm rooms become corporations. It had watched personal computers become industries. It had watched search engines reorganize information. It had watched phones become portals into almost every part of daily life. By the early 2000s, the culture around technology had developed a powerful instinct. If someone young enough, intense enough, and certain enough said an old system was broken, people leaned forward. They wanted the next transformation. They wanted to be close when the future arrived. Elizabeth Holmes understood that desire. She did not ask investors to fund a normal medical device company. She asked them to enter history. And in the quiet rooms where money changes hands, history can be more persuasive than evidence. Before the trial, before the verdict, before the sentence, before the gray uniforms and the prison schedule, there was a black turtleneck, a pale face under bright lights, and a voice saying that the company was changing the world. For a long time, many people believed her. The company was called Theranos. It was formed from therapy and diagnosis. Even the name sounded like a bridge between suffering and certainty. But the bridge was not strong enough to carry the weight placed on it. By the end, the company valued at billions of dollars would have no product that matched its public promise. Patients would receive blood test results that had to be corrected, questioned, or voided. Employees would remember secrecy, pressure, compartmentalized teams, and fear. Investors would claim they had been deceived. Regulators would find serious deficiencies. Walgreens would walk away. The Wall Street Journal would pull the story open, and Elizabeth Holmes, once celebrated as the youngest self-made female billionaire, would be convicted of defrauding investors and sentenced to more than 11 years in federal prison. The rise looked like a miracle. The fall looked like a warning. To understand Theranos, we have to begin before the machine, before the Edison, before the Walgreens clinics, before the magazine covers, before the phrase "one drop of blood" became a promise and then an accusation. We begin with a young woman who wanted to become inevitable. Elizabeth Holmes was born in Washington, D.C. in 1984. Her family was not Silicon Valley royalty. It was something different. It was serious, ambitious, connected to public institutions, aware of history, and comfortable around powerful names. Her father worked in government and international development. Her mother worked on Capitol Hill. The household carried a sense that achievement mattered, that public service mattered, that important people moved through important rooms and made decisions that shaped the lives of people they would never meet. Children raised near that atmosphere often learn to speak the language of purpose early. They learn that ambition can be dressed as mission. They learn that a life should point towards something larger than comfort. Holmes absorbed that mood. She also absorbed a fascination with greatness. She admired entrepreneurs. She admired people who had not simply joined institutions but bent institutions around themselves. She studied Mandarin. She sold C++ compilers to Chinese universities as a teenager. She was intense before intensity became her public brand. By the time she entered Stanford, she was already carrying a picture of herself that was larger than a student schedule. Stanford mattered because Stanford sat close to the mythic center of modern technology. The campus was not just a campus. It was a bridge into Sand Hill Road, venture capital, engineering labs, founders, patents, startups, and the particular California belief that a small group of people with enough conviction can redesign the world. Holmes studied chemical engineering. She worked in the lab of Channing Robertson, a Stanford professor who would later become one of her early supporters. She was not uninterested in science. That would be too simple. She was interested in science, but she was more interested in what science could become when attached to a heroic story. She began with a patch idea, a device that might monitor the body and deliver medicine. The concept was ambitious, almost science fiction-like, and it showed an early pattern. She was drawn to the interface between diagnosis, treatment, and control. She wanted medicine to become continuous, immediate, and personal. The dream was not foolish in itself. Medicine did need better access. Diagnostics did need improvement. Patients did need cheaper, faster, more convenient testing. A real problem existed. Theranos did not invent the problem. It invented a story about solving it before the solution existed. That distinction would matter later. At Stanford, Holmes noticed blood testing. She saw a procedure most people accepted as ordinary: a needle, a vial, a laboratory, a weight, a bill. She asked why it had to be that way. This question was powerful because it was emotional and technical at the same time. Many people dislike needles. Many people delay blood tests because the process is inconvenient. Many people live far from easy medical access. Many conditions become easier to treat if detected earlier. If a blood test could be made painless, cheap, fast, and available in pharmacies, the benefit could be enormous. That was the truth inside the Theranos promise. The problem was real. The need was real. The market was real. The patients were real. The missing piece was the machine. In 2003, Holmes left Stanford. She used tuition money her parents had saved and put it into the company. She was 19. In the story later told about Theranos, this detail became central. The dropout founder, the young visionary, the person impatient with school because the world needed what she was building. Silicon Valley loved that shape. It had already canonized it. Leaving college could be read as recklessness. But in the Valley, under the right lighting, it could also be read as destiny. Holmes understood that. She stepped into the role with extraordinary discipline. She did not present herself as a medical tinkerer. She presented herself as someone carrying a moral revolution. The early company was first called Real-Time Cures. That name was too direct, too medical, and perhaps too grand. Theranos sounded cleaner. It sounded technical and smooth. It suggested a whole new field without explaining itself too much. In the early years, the company was small. There were engineers, prototypes, private demonstrations, and the beginnings of a culture that would later become famous for secrecy. Secrecy can feel natural in a startup. A company wants to protect intellectual property. It wants to move before competitors notice. It wants to control information. But at Theranos, secrecy became more than protection. It became a way of life. Employees were separated into teams. Information was compartmentalized. People working on one part of the machine often did not know enough about the rest to judge whether the whole thing worked. Legal agreements were strict. Former employees understood that speaking could carry consequences. Inside the company, loyalty and silence moved together. That culture did not appear all at once. It hardened over time. At the center of the company was the device. The device was given names. One of them was Edison, a name chosen carefully. Thomas Edison suggested invention, electricity, American ingenuity, a machine changing ordinary life. A medical device named Edison sounded like progress with a historical echo. But names can create a mood that engineering has not earned. The Edison was supposed to run many diagnostic tests from a tiny amount of blood. A finger prick would produce a sample. The sample would go into a cartridge. The cartridge would enter the machine. The machine would return results. That was the public imagination. That was the pitch. That was the story investors heard. The engineering reality was far harder. Blood is not a slogan. It is a complex biological fluid. Tests require different chemistries. Different analytes require different methods. Some tests need precise quantities. Some need plasma. Some need serum. Some are sensitive to contamination, dilution, temperature, time, and handling. Venous blood drawn from the arm is not the same as capillary blood from a finger. A finger stick sample can be more variable. It can contain tissue fluid. It can be affected by squeezing the finger. It arrives in small volume. A small volume means less material to work with. If the sample has to be diluted to run many tests, dilution creates another layer of risk. In a software company, a bug can be patched after users complain. In a diagnostic company, an error can change a medical decision before anyone realizes what happened. That is why laboratory medicine is cautious. It is why validation matters. It is why instruments are compared against known standards. It is why quality control exists. It is why a result is not just a number on a screen, but a claim made to a doctor and a patient. Holmes spoke about democratizing testing. The phrase sounded humane. It implied that older laboratories were slow, expensive, and inconvenient because the system had grown complacent. There was some truth there. Healthcare access is uneven. Costs can be confusing and high. Patients often wait too long for answers. But Theranos needed more than a moral critique of the old system. It needed a reliable replacement. Inside Theranos, engineers struggled. Some believed in the mission. Some worked late. Some tried to solve the chemistry, the mechanics, the sample handling, the cartridge design, and the automation. They were not all cynical people trapped in a lie. Many were technical workers inside a difficult project that had been publicly promised too soon. This is important. A collapse is rarely built only from bad intentions. It is often built from good intentions placed under impossible pressure. The engineers faced physics. The executives faced expectations. The story faced reality. Reality was not cooperating. When technical workers said the device did not do what was being promised, the organization had a choice. It could reduce the promise, or it could pressure the workers. Theranos usually protected the promise. That choice became the company's moral direction. A scientist who hears a negative result is supposed to move closer to the truth. A storyteller who hears a negative result may move closer to persuasion. Theranos moved too often toward persuasion. The company raised money. It recruited people, it attracted names, it refined the image. And then it built a board that became one of the strangest facts in the story. The board was remarkable, not because it was filled with laboratory experts, because it was filled with authority. George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, William Perry, James Mattis, Sam Nunn. These names belonged to geopolitics, defense, diplomacy, and government. They had sat in rooms where nations were discussed. They had advised presidents. They carried institutional weight. A small blood testing startup with that board looked serious before anyone examined the machine. That was the board's power. It made Theranos feel pre-approved by history. But the board's prestige concealed a weakness. Most members were not experts in clinical laboratory science. They were not the people best equipped to interrogate assay validation, sample dilution, proficiency testing, reference ranges, or the behavior of capillary blood under modified laboratory conditions. They were impressive people. They were not the right people for the central question. Does the technology work? That question should have been boring, technical, and relentless. At Theranos, it was often surrounded by biography, mission, secrecy, and trust. The board was not the only group that trusted. Investors trusted. Some of them were powerful families and private individuals rather than traditional medical technology investors. This mattered. Many did not demand the same clinical evidence that a specialized diagnostics investor might have demanded. They were investing in the founder, the story, the board, the mission, and the possibility that they were seeing a rare chance before the public market did. Theranos gave them a private door into a future that sounded enormous. A company that could place testing inside pharmacies, reduce costs, and create a national diagnostic network would be worth a fortune. It would not be a small medical device firm. It would become infrastructure. That is the kind of scale investors dream about. Holmes learned how to speak to that dream. She did not fill rooms with caveats. She spoke as if the revolution had already passed through the laboratory and was simply waiting for distribution. She described the future in the present tense. That is a powerful rhetorical move. The future is coming sounds uncertain. The future is here sounds investable. The company continued to build its public story. The black turtleneck became part of the iconography. The comparison to Steve Jobs became common. Silicon Valley had a visual language for genius. Minimal clothes, simple words, austere rooms. A founder who seemed to need less sleep and fewer doubts than ordinary people. Holmes adopted that language. She did not look like a traditional medical executive. She looked like a founder from a myth. The press was ready for that myth. Media coverage described her as a rare woman rising through a male-dominated startup world. That part mattered too. People wanted her to succeed for reasons beyond financial return. A young woman founder transforming medicine was an emotionally powerful story. It offered correction to Silicon Valley's gender imbalance. It offered a new face of genius. It offered a heroic counterexample. That desire made the story warmer. It also made skepticism more socially complicated. To question Theranos could feel like questioning a symbol people needed. But symbols do not run blood tests. Machines do. By 2013, Theranos moved into a new stage. The company began to emerge from secrecy into public partnership. Walgreens became the most important public validation. The plan was to place Theranos wellness centers inside Walgreens pharmacies. This was the bridge from conference room promise to patient reality. It transformed the story. Before Walgreens, Theranos could be dismissed by skeptics as a private startup making private claims. With Walgreens, the company entered ordinary life. A patient could walk into a pharmacy and encounter the future Holmes had described. A small test, a quick result, a lower price, a familiar store. For Walgreens, the potential was obvious. Pharmacies were trying to become more central to basic healthcare. Retail clinics were expanding. Consumers wanted convenience. If Theranos worked, Walgreens could become the front door to a new form of diagnostic access. But a partnership with a large brand also creates borrowed trust. Customers do not separate the startup from the pharmacy as cleanly as lawyers might. If the test is inside Walgreens, many people assume Walgreens has checked. If Walgreens has checked, the test must be real. That assumption became part of the problem. The same dynamic applied to investors and the board. Each layer of authority made the next person less likely to ask for first principles proof. A famous board implies credibility. A respected pharmacy implies credibility. Major investors imply credibility. Magazine covers imply credibility. The founder's certainty implies credibility. Together, these layers can substitute for the one thing that matters most in medicine: evidence. The evidence was not there at the level the public story required. For many tests, Theranos was using conventional machines made by other companies. Some samples were diluted. Some machines were modified. The Edison did not run the broad menu Theranos implied it could run. The gap between public promise and laboratory practice was large. This gap was not a branding issue. It was a patient safety issue. A wrong result can frighten someone. It can reassure someone falsely. It can send a doctor down the wrong path. It can change medication. It can prompt more testing. It can produce days of fear that no later correction fully erases. A blood test is intimate because the number becomes part of how a person understands their body. Theranos interfered with that trust. Inside the company, some people saw enough to worry deeply. One of them was Tyler Schultz, the grandson of George Schultz. He had joined Theranos and later became one of the whistleblowers whose concerns helped expose the company. His position was painful because the scandal entered his family through the boardroom. George Schultz believed in Holmes. Tyler Schultz saw problems from inside the lab. That created a conflict not only between employee and company, but between grandson and grandfather, between private loyalty and public truth. Whistleblowing often sounds noble from a distance. Inside a family, inside a career, inside a legal threat, it is much harder. Another key whistleblower was Erica Chung. She had worked at Theranos as a young laboratory associate. She saw quality control failures. She raised concerns. She eventually left and spoke to regulators. Her role matters because she was not a famous investor or a powerful board member. She was a person close enough to the work to know when the work was not matching the promise. Many collapses depend on people like that. People low enough in the hierarchy to see the operational truth. People high enough in conscience to speak when they understand what silence protects. Theranos did not welcome this kind of truth. The company was known for legal pressure. Former employees described fear of being sued. Lawyers sent warnings. Information was controlled. The story had to be defended not only against competitors, but against people who had worked inside the company. That is a sign. When a company must use fear to keep reality from leaving the building, the problem is already deep. Still, for the public, the myth continued. Holmes appeared on stages. She appeared in interviews. She spoke with the same calm force. She was praised by political leaders and business figures. In 2014, Forbes estimated her net worth at billions. That estimate depended on the company's valuation. The valuation depended on the story. The story depended on the technology. The technology did not support the story. This is how paper wealth can vanish. A valuation is not money in a vault. It is a collective belief about the future value of a company. When that belief is attached to false assumptions, it can collapse quickly. For a time, however, the valuation gave the story even more power. People reasoned backward from wealth. If she is worth billions, the company must be real. If the company is worth billions, the device must work. If the device works, critics must be missing something. This reasoning is common. It is also dangerous. The market price of a private company is not a peer-reviewed study. A magazine cover is not clinical validation. A billionaire estimate is not a diagnostic certificate. Theranos blurred these categories until the public story felt stronger than the scientific record. Then John Carreyrou entered the story. Carreyrou was an investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal. He had experience following complex stories and pushing through denials. A tip reached him. The details were alarming. The device did not work as advertised. The company was using conventional equipment. The internal story differed from the external story. Carreyrou began calling former employees, doctors, and people close to the company. Investigative reporting is slow work. It does not begin as a public confrontation. It begins with calls, messages, documents, small confirmations. A person says one thing. Another person, in another place, says something that matches. A pattern forms. The company denies. The reporter asks again. The pattern grows. Theranos fought back hard. It had powerful lawyers. It had a carefully built public image. It had relationships. It had a founder trained to appear unshaken. The company did what companies in danger often do. It attacked the credibility of the questions. But the questions continued. In October 2015, the Wall Street Journal published the first major article challenging Theranos. It reported that the company was not using its own technology for most of the tests it offered, and that former employees had raised concerns about accuracy. That article did not immediately end the company. Myths rarely die in one blow. Holmes went on television. She said the story was false. She said, "This is what happens when you work to change things. First they think you are crazy, then they fight you. Then," she implied, "you change the world." The line worked because it borrowed from the mythology of innovation. Every real innovator faces resistance. Every disruptive company attracts skeptics. Every entrenched industry has reasons to protect itself. These things can be true. But the existence of skepticism does not prove a company is right. Sometimes people fight you because you are wrong. This distinction can be hard to see when a founder has turned criticism into evidence of greatness. Holmes used that frame. For a moment, some supporters stayed with her. But regulators now had reason to look harder. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services inspected Theranos laboratories. Regulators use a different language from magazine profiles. They do not care about turtlenecks. They do not care about mission statements. They care about quality systems, proficiency testing, validation, documentation, personnel, instruments, and whether patient results can be trusted. The inspection findings were severe. CMS found deficiencies at the Newark, California laboratory. The findings raised concerns about patient health and safety. Theranos eventually voided or corrected a large number of test results. The company's laboratory certification was put at risk. Holmes faced a ban from owning or operating a clinical laboratory. This was the moment the story moved from journalism to regulatory consequence. The company could still say it was misunderstood. It could not simply talk away a laboratory inspection. Walgreens then had to respond. The partnership that had once validated Theranos became a liability. Walgreens had placed its own reputation beside the startup's claims. Now those claims were cracking. The company separated. Theranos wellness centers closed. Safeway, which had built out spaces for a Theranos partnership that never fully launched, also became part of the story of borrowed trust and expensive belief. What had looked like distribution infrastructure now looked like evidence of how far the promise had traveled before the proof arrived. The fall accelerated. The board changed. The company tried to pivot. Holmes said Theranos would focus on a new device, but the central trust was gone. A medical technology company can survive technical setbacks. It cannot survive if patients, partners, regulators, and investors no longer trust its claims. Trust is not decorative in healthcare. It is the product beneath the product. By 2018, the legal consequences became direct. The Securities and Exchange Commission charged Holmes and Theranos with massive fraud. Holmes settled with the SEC without admitting or denying the allegations. She gave up control of the company, paid a penalty, and was barred from serving as an officer or director of a public company for 10 years. Then the Department of Justice indicted Elizabeth Holmes and Ramesh Balwani. The charges allege wire fraud and conspiracy. The government said they had deceived investors and patients about the capabilities of Theranos technology. A criminal case changes the temperature of a story. A failed startup can be forgiven by culture. A criminal indictment cannot be absorbed into the language of disruption so easily. Holmes had long presented herself as a founder who believed too much. The government presented her as a person who knew enough to deceive. Those two versions would meet in court. Before the trial, Theranos itself disappeared. The company dissolved in 2018. The offices emptied. The devices no longer carried a future. The name had become toxic. Investors wrote down their stakes. Employees moved on. Patients remained with memories of results they had trusted. A company that had promised to make blood testing simple left behind one of the most complicated business scandals of the decade. The trial of Elizabeth Holmes began in 2021. By then, the story had become famous. There was a book, there were podcasts, there were documentaries, there were Halloween costumes. There was a strange cultural hunger around the image of Holmes. The black turtleneck, the voice, the unblinking interviews, the board of elder statesmen, the young female billionaire, the blood machine that did not work. Everything about the story seemed designed for public fascination. But a courtroom is not supposed to be fascinated. It is supposed to decide what can be proven. The prosecution focused heavily on investors. It showed presentations, claims, financial projections, and statements about the technology. Witnesses described what they believed and what they were told. Former employees described internal problems. Laboratory personnel described concerns about testing. Patients described the human stakes. The defense argued that Holmes had believed in the company. They portrayed Theranos as a startup that failed, not as a fraud. They emphasized that failure is not a crime. That point is important. Startups fail all the time. Ambitious technical projects fail. Founders overestimate timelines. Investors take risks. Medicine is hard. Science is hard. A company can promise too much and still be legally different from a criminal scheme. The trial turned on knowledge and misrepresentation. What did Holmes know? When did she know it? What did she tell investors anyway? What did she conceal? What did she permit others to believe? This is why the trial mattered beyond Theranos. Silicon Valley often lives in the gap between current reality and future possibility. Founders sell what the company might become. Investors fund the distance between prototype and product. Optimism is part of the machine. But criminal fraud begins when optimism becomes a false statement about the present. There is a difference between saying we are trying to build this and saying we have built this. Theranos blurred that difference. The jury convicted Holmes on 4 counts related to defrauding investors. It did not convict her on every count. The split verdict mattered. It showed the jury drew lines rather than simply punishing the story. But the conviction was enough to transform her public identity permanently. In November 2022, she was sentenced to 135 months in prison, 11 years and 3 months. Ramesh Balwani was tried separately. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 155 months. The appeals process continued, and later appellate decisions upheld the convictions. The legal story did not end the moral story. It gave it a boundary. The prison sentence gave the public a final image. Not a founder on stage, not a billionaire profile, not a medical visionary. A federal inmate. The transformation was stark. It was also incomplete if we stopped there. Because Theranos is not only a story about Elizabeth Holmes. It is a story about everyone who wanted the promise to be true. It is a story about investors who accepted prestige as due diligence. It is a story about a pharmacy chain that saw a strategic opportunity. It is a story about regulators who arrived after patients had already received results. It is a story about journalists who first amplified the myth and later helped dismantle it. It is a story about employees who stayed silent, employees who left, and employees who spoke. It is a story about medicine being treated like software. That last part is crucial. Silicon Valley's great strength is speed. Move quickly, test, iterate, launch, fix, scale. In many industries, this can create extraordinary innovation. In medicine, the cost of error is different. A wrong song recommendation is irritating. A wrong blood test can change a life. A failed social app disappears. A failed diagnostic test leaves someone frightened, misled, or untreated. Healthcare cannot be disrupted by pretending the body behaves like a platform. The body is not a market segment. It is not a user base. It is chemistry, tissue, time, error margins, and irreversible consequences. This does not mean healthcare should never change. It must change. It needs better access. It needs better affordability. It needs better patient experience. But it must change through evidence, validation, and humility before biology. Theranos had ambition without enough humility. That is one reason the story still feels unsettling. The promise itself was not ugly, it was beautiful. That makes the fraud harder to emotionally categorize. A scam that offers something cruel is easy to reject. A scam that offers something humane can move farther before people challenge it. Nobody wanted to be against cheaper blood tests. Nobody wanted to be against early detection. Nobody wanted to be against a young woman founder changing medicine. Nobody wanted to be against a future where patients had more control. Theranos hid inside things people wanted to support. The company did not need to invent desire. It only needed to attach itself to desire. The desire did the rest. This is why the story has the shape of a fable. A single drop of blood carried more meaning than a vial ever should. It became a symbol. It symbolized convenience. It symbolized control. It symbolized a future where patients did not wait for institutions. It symbolized a founder's fear of needles, transformed into a universal solution. But symbols are dangerous in science. A symbol can be true emotionally and false technically. The drop of blood was emotionally true. People did want less painful testing. Technically, the promise did not hold. The company treated the emotional truth as if it could replace the technical truth. It could not. Reality is patient. Reality does not rush into interviews. It does not respond to branding. It does not care about the board. It does not care whether the founder is inspiring. It simply waits until the machine is asked to produce the result. At Theranos, the machine could not produce the revolution, and so the language around it eventually failed. The company's internal language deserves attention. Employees described a culture where information was controlled and teams were isolated. This matters because scientific progress depends on shared reality. Scientists need to compare results. Engineers need to know when adjacent systems fail. Quality people need access. Laboratory directors need authority. If each group sees only one piece, the organization can prevent the full picture from forming. That may protect secrecy. It also protects denial. A compartmentalized company can keep going because no single person below the top can prove the whole thing is broken. Each person sees a part. Each concern can be treated as local. The machine jams here. The assay fails there. The sample volume is not enough in this case. The quality control data is bad in that case. The public claim remains untouched because the public claim belongs to a different room. Theranos had many rooms. In one room, engineers struggled with mechanics. In another, laboratory workers worried about results. In another, lawyers warned former employees. In another, executives spoke to investors. In another, Walgreens prepared retail spaces. In another, patients waited for numbers. A collapse happens when those rooms finally connect. The Wall Street Journal article connected them. Regulators connected them. The trial connected them. Once the rooms connected, the story could no longer survive by compartment. This is one of the practical lessons of Theranos. Transparency is not a luxury in medicine. It is a safety system. If the people responsible for quality cannot speak freely, patient risk increases. If laboratory directors cannot exercise independent judgment, patient risk increases. If legal fear replaces technical correction, patient risk increases. If the company's public story becomes more sacred than the data, patient risk increases. That is what happened. Another lesson is about charisma. Charisma can be quiet. Holmes was not a loud founder. Her style was controlled. She held eye contact. She used silence. She spoke slowly. She did not fill every gap with nervous explanation. For some people, that made her seem more credible. We often confuse lack of visible doubt with knowledge. This is a human weakness. A person who hesitates may be honest. A person who never hesitates may be performing. But in rooms where money and ambition are present, hesitation can be punished and certainty can be rewarded. Holmes became a master of rewarded certainty. She had learned that a deep voice and a steady gaze could make people lean toward belief. The voice did not need to prove the chemistry. It only needed to keep the room from asking too hard for too long. This is not magic. It is social psychology. People defer to confidence. People defer to prestigious associations. People defer to stories aligned with their hopes. People defer to founders who appear to carry no doubt. Theranos was built in the space created by those deferences. It is tempting to say investors should have known better. Many should have. But the deeper lesson is not that some wealthy people were fooled. The deeper lesson is that sophisticated people can be fooled when a story matches what they want to believe about the future. The Theranos investors were not simply buying blood tests. They were buying proximity to transformation. They were buying a place in a story where healthcare became simpler because someone brave enough had ignored old assumptions. That story was valuable before it was true. And because it was valuable, it became harder to challenge. The role of journalism is complicated too. Early profiles helped build Holmes. They repeated claims. They celebrated the image. They turned the founder into a public figure. Later, investigative journalism helped expose the company. The same media ecosystem that creates myths can also puncture them. This is not hypocrisy alone. It is the cycle of attention. Attention likes stories with faces. A founder makes a better story than an assay validation report. A young billionaire makes a better headline than a laboratory quality manual. The public learned the face first. It learned the test failures later. That order matters. Once the face is loved, facts have to work harder. The facts did eventually arrive. They arrived through documents. They arrived through testimony. They arrived through regulators. They arrived through patients. They arrived through former employees. They arrived through the court record. By then, the gap between image and reality had become too large to repair. Theranos tried to reframe itself. It said the reporting was wrong. It said old industries resist change. It said the company was being attacked because it was disruptive. This defense can be persuasive because sometimes it is true. Real innovations do face resistance. But a company cannot use the existence of resistance as proof of innovation. A fake breakthrough and a real breakthrough can both attract critics. The difference is evidence. Theranos never produced the evidence that could support the scale of its promise. If it had, the story would be different. If independent laboratories had validated the Edison across a broad menu of tests, the critics would have faded. If peer-reviewed data had matched the claims, the company would have had a foundation. If regulators had seen robust systems, the company could have continued. But the evidence did not come. The machine remained smaller than the myth. Patients are the quietest part of the story and the most important. Business audiences often focus on valuation. $9 billion, $4.5 billion net worth, hundreds of millions raised. These numbers are dramatic. But a patient does not experience Theranos as valuation. A patient experiences Theranos as a result. A number on a page, a flag on a lab report, a call from a doctor, a moment of fear. The patient asks a simple question: can I trust this? Every medical laboratory exists to make the answer yes. Not perfect. No test is perfect. Validated, controlled, understood, and honestly represented. Theranos broke that moral contract. The company sold convenience while the deeper guarantee was accuracy. Convenience without accuracy is not healthcare. It is theater. That is why the scandal felt different from ordinary startup failure. A failed app wastes time. A failed gadget wastes money. A failed blood test can enter someone's fear. It can change a decision in the private space between a patient and their body. That space deserves seriousness. Theranos did not give it enough. The company's downfall also changed the way people looked at Silicon Valley healthcare startups. After Theranos, claims about medical disruption carried a sharper edge. Investors became more aware of validation. Reporters asked harder questions. Regulators were part of the public conversation. Founders learned that healthcare is not simply another industry to be rebranded. Some lessons were healthy. Some created suspicion around legitimate innovators. That is another cost of fraud. It does not only harm direct victims, it poisons the environment for people doing real work. A scientist with a careful, validated product has to answer questions created by someone else's deception. Trust is a shared resource. Theranos spent heavily from that resource. Now think of the actual laboratory world Theranos claimed to replace. It is not glamorous. It is controlled. Machines hum. Technologists check samples. Quality controls are run. Results that look wrong are repeated. Maintenance logs are kept. Calibration happens. A real lab can seem slow because it refuses to pretend uncertainty is gone. That slowness can frustrate patients. It can frustrate entrepreneurs. But much of that slowness is the discipline of accuracy. Theranos treated that discipline as an old-world obstacle. In reality, it was the protection patients needed. This is one reason the story belongs in a sleep documentary. Told quickly, Theranos can feel like spectacle. The voice, the turtleneck, the famous board, the prison sentence. Told slowly, it becomes something else. It becomes a meditation on proof, on how evidence is boring until it is missing, on how careful work can seem unimpressive beside a beautiful story, on how the systems that protect people are often least visible when they are working. The quiet truth of laboratory medicine is that success often looks like nothing happening. No panic, no false alarm, no wrong medication, no unnecessary procedure, no missed condition because a number was falsely reassuring. Accuracy prevents drama. Theranos created drama because it skipped too much of the work that prevents it. The legal record continued after sentencing. Appeals were filed. Sentences were calculated. Restitution was ordered. Holmes began serving her sentence in federal prison. Balwani began serving his. The public occasionally returned to the story through updates about release dates, family visits, and legal decisions. But the central arc was complete. The founder, who had once stood for the future of medicine, had become a cautionary example in business ethics, healthcare regulation, and startup culture. Company itself had no future. The device that promised to change everything had become an object of evidence, memory, and warning. What remains now is the file. A file about blood, a file about performance, a file about investors, a file about patients, a file about the difference between vision and validation. That difference is the heart of the story. Vision sees what could exist. Validation proves what does exist. A healthy company needs both. Theranos had too much vision and not enough validation. It confused the imagined future with the tested present. It asked patients and investors to live inside that confusion. The company's defenders sometimes argued that Holmes was trying to build something real. Perhaps she was. Trying matters. But trying is not enough when you are sending medical results to patients. A founder may believe deeply. A patient needs accuracy. Belief does not calibrate a machine. Belief does not fix dilution error. Belief does not make a test clinically valid. Belief does not replace quality control. Belief can carry a person through difficulty. It cannot carry a blood sample through chemistry. That is the quiet boundary Theranos crossed. The company took the language of belief into a place that required proof. The story of Elizabeth Holmes also shows how personal image can become infrastructure. Her voice, clothes, interviews, and origin story were not side details. They helped raise money. They helped recruit attention. They helped quiet doubts. They gave the company a human center. In modern business, the founder can become a product. The founder's personality becomes part of valuation. The founder's myth becomes part of the pitch. The founder's certainty becomes part of due diligence. This is dangerous. Founders are not instruments. They are not clinical evidence. They are not laboratories. They are people with incentives, blind spots, and ambitions. When a company relies too heavily on the founder's aura, every technical question becomes personal. To question the product becomes questioning the founder. To question the founder becomes questioning the mission. To question the mission becomes betrayal. Theranos operated too close to that logic. It made criticism morally difficult. It made loyalty feel virtuous. It made doubt feel destructive. Science needs doubt. Medicine needs doubt. A blood test company needs people who are allowed to say the result is wrong. If doubt is pushed out, error stays. An error in medicine does not stay abstract. It enters bodies and lives. The story winds now toward its quieter end. The offices are gone. The company name survives mostly in headlines, lectures, documentaries, court records, and memory. The board members return to their other legacies, though Theranos remains attached to their judgment. The investors absorbed losses. The patients were left with questions about results they once trusted. The employees carried different versions of the experience. Some with regret, some with anger, some with relief that the truth came out. Some with the complicated feeling of having worked very hard inside something that became a scandal. That feeling matters too. Not everyone inside Theranos was trying to deceive. Many were trying to work. Many were trying to solve problems. Many were young, ambitious, and drawn to a mission that sounded meaningful. A bad company can contain good work. A false promise can attract sincere people. That is part of the tragedy. The company used sincere desire as fuel. The desire to help patients. The desire to change medicine. The desire to prove that a young woman founder could build a giant company. The desire to believe technology could make healthcare kinder. All of those desires were real. They deserved a better company. In the end, Theranos left behind a simple question. What do we owe the truth when the lie is beautiful? That question is not only for medicine. It belongs to business, politics, technology, media, investing, and ordinary life. Beautiful lies are harder to resist than ugly ones. They come dressed as hope. They flatter our values. They tell us the world can be better without asking us to wait for proof. They make skepticism feel cruel. But if the stakes are high, skepticism is care. In medicine, skepticism is love in technical form. It is the repeated test, the controlled study, the calibration, the uncomfortable question, the refusal to send a number until the number can be trusted. Theranos mistook that care for obstruction. That was its deepest failure. The final image can be very small. Not a courtroom, not a magazine cover, not a stage. A drop of blood on a white surface. One small drop. Within it, there is information. But the information does not reveal itself to desire. It reveals itself to method, to chemistry, to instruments that work, to people who respect the limits of what they know. Theranos promised to read that drop with a machine that did not live up to the promise. Reality did not shout. It simply waited until the promise had to be measured. Then the promise failed, and once it failed, the voice could not save it. No voice can make a false result true. No costume can make a device validated. No board member can turn hope into evidence. No valuation can make a patient safe. The machine either works or it does not. That is the calm, merciless mercy of science. It gives the same answer whether the founder is famous or unknown. It gives the same answer whether investors are powerful or ordinary. It gives the same answer whether the story is beautiful or dull. It asks for proof. Theranos did not have enough. So the file closes. Not because the story is forgotten, because the lesson has become clear. The room is quiet now. The laboratory lights are off. The Walgreens signs have changed. The boardroom chairs are empty. The investors have moved on. The reporters have filed their stories. The defendants have heard their sentences. And somewhere tonight, in a real laboratory, a real blood sample is being handled carefully. Not dramatically, not heroically, just carefully. A technician checks the sample. A machine runs a validated test. A result is reviewed. If something looks wrong, someone checks again. That quiet work continues beyond the scandal. It is slower than a promise. It is less glamorous than a magazine cover. It is worth more. Because a true result, delivered without spectacle, is one of the most valuable things medicine can offer. Theranos wanted the world to believe in the future. The future was not enough. Medicine needed the truth. And the truth, after years of waiting, finally spoke. There is another way to understand the rise of Theranos. It is to see it as a story about shortcuts. Not only technical shortcuts, social shortcuts, emotional shortcuts, institutional shortcuts. A shortcut from idea to valuation. A shortcut from mission to trust. A shortcut from founder charisma to scientific credibility. A shortcut from board prestige to medical validation. A shortcut from a finger prick demonstration to a national diagnostic company. Shortcuts are tempting because the full path is slow. The full path would have required years of transparent validation. The full path would have required publishing data. The full path would have required independent experts asking unromantic questions. The full path would have required telling investors exactly what the device could do and what it could not do. The full path would have required telling partners that the test menu was not ready. The full path might have produced a smaller company. It might have produced a real product. But it would not have produced the myth quickly. Theranos chose the myth. Once a company chooses the myth, it becomes trapped by the myth. Every new claim must defend the old claim. Every delay must be explained as strategy. Every failure must be described as temporary. Every person who sees the gap must be managed. The company can no longer simply admit, "We are not there yet." That sentence becomes too expensive. It threatens valuation. It threatens partnerships. It threatens the founder's image. It threatens the board's judgment. It threatens the employee's belief. So the company keeps moving. This movement can look like progress from outside. New offices, new hires, new partnerships, new press, new money. But motion is not proof. A company can move quickly while avoiding the one place it needs to go. The truth. Theranos avoided the full truth for too long. The company had a relationship with secrecy that went beyond ordinary startup caution. Secrecy can be rational before a patent is filed. It can be rational when competitors are watching. But secrecy becomes dangerous when it prevents verification. A medical device cannot ask society for trust while refusing the processes that create trust. It cannot hide behind trade secrets when patient results are at stake. It cannot protect its story more fiercely than it protects the people using the product. That inversion is part of the scandal. Theranos protected the story. Patients needed protection from bad results. Investors needed protection from false claims. Employees needed protection from retaliation when they raised concerns. The story received the strongest defense. This is why the legal threats mattered. They were not merely aggressive business tactics. They shaped the flow of truth. If former employees are afraid to speak, evidence travels slower. If evidence travels slower, the public remains exposed longer. If the public remains exposed longer, harm becomes more likely. Law can be used to protect legitimate secrets. It can also be used to protect a failing illusion. Theranos used legal pressure in ways that made the illusion last longer. That prolonging is part of the harm. The case also shows the weakness of glamour around private companies. Public companies must disclose more. Private companies can be more opaque. Theranos used the private market to raise enormous sums without the same public scrutiny that a public company would face. Private investors had access, but access is not the same as verification. Some investors received demonstrations, some received claims, some received projections, but the central truth remained hidden or misrepresents. A private valuation can become a headline without becoming a public examination. That headline can then attract more belief. it becomes a loop. Valuation creates attention. Attention creates credibility. Credibility attracts more money. More money supports a higher valuation. The loop continues until reality breaks it. At Theranos, reality broke it through reporting, regulation, and prosecution. But the break came after years of celebration. This delay is painful to consider. Why did it take so long? Part of the answer is that the story contains so many shields: a noble mission, a young founder, a famous board, a secretive technology, a powerful legal team, a private company structure, a partnership with a trusted pharmacy, a culture that punished internal doubt. Each shield may have seemed reasonable in isolation. Together they protected falsehood. That is how systems fail. Not always because one wall is too strong, because many small walls together block the truth. The Theranos story also forces a question about experts. Experts were not absent. Some experts warned. Some technical people doubted. Some laboratory professionals knew the claims were difficult. But the most visible rooms were often not organized around the right expertise. Prestige from one domain was treated as credibility in another. A military leader can understand war and still not understand blood assay validation. A statesman can understand diplomacy and still not understand laboratory quality systems. A banker can understand deals and still not understand capillary sample variability. This does not diminish those people's accomplishments. It shows the danger of transferable awe. We see authority in one field and carry it into another. Theranos benefited from that human habit. The board looked impressive, so the company looked impressive. The missing question remained missing. What would an expert in clinical pathology say? What would a laboratory medicine specialist demand? What would a regulatory scientist need to see? What would a cautious physician require before trusting patient results? Those questions arrived too late and with too little power. By the time they became public, the company had already treated patients. This is why the lessons must be applied early. Not after the documentary. Not after the verdict. Before the partnership. Before the first patient. Before the valuation becomes mythology. A second lesson concerns language. Theranos used language elegantly. Empowerment, access, preventive care, transparency for patients, democratization. The language was not wrong in moral direction. It was wrong in relation to the product. A company can speak the language of patient empowerment while disempowering patients with unreliable information. A company can speak about transparency while hiding its methods. A company can speak about prevention while creating confusion. This is why values must be tied to mechanisms. It is not enough to say access. Access to what? Accurate tests, validated processes, clear limitations, responsible follow-up. Without those, access becomes a door into uncertainty. Theranos offered a door before it had built the room safely. The Walgreens clinics made that door visible. Imagine someone entering a pharmacy. They see familiar aisles, medicine, soap, greeting cards, a pharmacy counter. Inside that ordinary space, a new kind of blood testing is offered. The setting is comforting because it is familiar. A hospital can feel intimidating. A pharmacy feels everyday. That everyday feeling reduces caution. A person may think, if this is here, it must be approved. If the pharmacy allows it, it must be safe. If the price is lower and the process is easier, why not use it? That is the power of retail healthcare. It can expand access. It can also transfer trust from a known brand to a new technology before the technology earns it. Walgreens gave Theranos the glow of familiarity. That glow reached patients. When the partnership ended, the glow disappeared quickly. But the memory of trust remained. For some patients, the damage was emotional more than physical. Fear matters. A false alarm can occupy the mind completely. A person can spend hours or days imagining disease, death, treatment, family conversations, and a changed life. When the correction comes, relief arrives, but the lost fear does not vanish from history. It was lived. A wrong number created real time inside a real person. Business stories often ignore that kind of harm because it is hard to count. Theranos reminds us that what is hard to count can still be central. Investors lost money. That is visible. Patients lost trust. That is harder to measure. The trust may have been more precious. Another part of the story is Ramesh Balwani. Known as Sunny, he joined Theranos in a senior role and became the company's president and chief operating officer. He was older than Holmes. He had business experience. He was also her romantic partner for part of the company's life, a relationship not disclosed to many investors and board members for years. Balwani's presence shaped the company's culture. Former employees described him as forceful and intimidating. In court, his role became part of a separate criminal trial. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to a longer prison term than Holmes. Holmes, in her defense, described an abusive relationship and argued that Balwani exerted control over her. The jury still convicted her on investor fraud counts. The Balwani story complicates the psychology but does not erase the central facts. Theranos represented what its technology could do. Investors were deceived. Patients were placed at risk. The company's leadership participated in the public story. A business collapse often contains personal relationships that later become legal and moral arguments. Theranos was no exception. The public, however, often simplified it back into one face: Elizabeth Holmes. This simplification is understandable. She was the founder. She was the symbol. She was the person on the covers. She was the voice. But the fuller story includes a system that wanted symbols. Without that system, the symbol would not have traveled as far. The investor meetings, the board introductions, the media attention, the retail partnership, the legal intimidation, the secrecy, the Silicon Valley myth, the healthcare access dream, all of it carried the company forward. Holmes was responsible for her actions. The environment was responsible for making those actions powerful. That is the difference between blame and understanding. Blame names the person. Understanding maps the conditions. We need both. As the script moves deeper, we can slow the story down again. Picture the Theranos office late at night. The lights are still on. Engineers are tired. A machine is not behaving. A cartridge fails. A sample produces a result that does not match the known value. Someone reruns a test. Someone checks a log. Someone reports a problem. In a healthy culture, that problem becomes information. In a fearful culture, that problem becomes danger to the messenger. The difference is everything. Data must be allowed to disappoint the company. If data cannot disappoint, the company cannot learn. Theranos did not allow enough disappointment to enter the public story. The private data disappointed. The public story continued smiling. This split is exhausting for employees. It requires them to live in two realities: the reality of what the machine does, the reality of what leadership says. Over time, people adapt in different ways. Some leave, some speak, Some go quiet, some convince themselves the next version will work. Some separate their task from the larger question. Some stop asking. A company can survive for a long time on that fragmentation. But a medical company cannot become trustworthy that way. Eventually, the patient sits at the end of the system. The patient does not receive the internal explanation. The patient receives the number. That number carries the whole company inside it. The engineering, the quality control, the leadership, the honesty, the validation, the culture. If any part fails badly enough, the number becomes suspect. Theranos sent numbers into the world before the company deserved that trust. That is the core harm. Now, the public story often focuses on the spectacular details: the voice, the turtleneck, the board, the billionaire valuation, the prison sentence. These details are memorable, but the central violation is quiet. A patient trusted a result. That is the moral center. Everything else orbits it. The investors matter because their money helped spread the company. The board matters because its prestige helped shield the company. The media matters because it amplified the company. The regulators matter because they eventually restrained the company. But the patient trust is the most delicate part. Medicine runs on that trust. A patient gives blood because they believe the system will treat the sample honestly. They may not understand the instrument. They may not know the assay. They may not know the regulatory framework. They trust the structure. Theranos used the structure without honoring it fully. This is why the story belongs next to Enron in a collapse archive. Enron sold confidence through complexity. Theranos sold confidence through simplicity. Enron made its business too hard to understand. Theranos made its promise too easy to believe. Enron hid weakness in financial structures. Theranos hid weakness behind secrecy, charisma, and medical hope. Both stories show belief outrunning truth. Both show respected institutions failing to ask enough. Both show warnings arriving before the end. Both show the collapse of trust as the real disaster. That comparison is useful. It tells us that corporate deception can wear different costumes. Sometimes it looks like trading floors and off-balance sheet entities. Sometimes it looks like a drop of blood and a white lab coat. The deeper shape is similar. A company tells a story the world wants. The story becomes valuable. The value protects the story. The truth becomes inconvenient. Then the truth returns with documents. In Theranos, the documents included regulatory findings, reporter notes, internal emails, legal filings, and trial exhibits. Paper replaced performance. The voice that had held rooms became one piece of evidence among many. The company that spoke in future tense was pulled into past tense. What did they say? When did they say it? What did they know? What did the machine do? What did the test show? What did investors hear? What did patients receive? This is how myth becomes record. The record is less glamorous. It is also more durable. Years from now, the Theranos story will likely be taught, not because of Holmes alone, but because it captures a recurring danger. A beautiful mission does not excuse false claims. A powerful founder does not replace technical proof. A famous board does not validate a device. A partnership does not guarantee safety. A private valuation does not equal truth. A patient result is not a marketing asset. These are simple lessons. Simple lessons are often the most difficult to keep in front of people when excitement rises. Excitement makes shortcuts feel reasonable. Theranos was excitement concentrated into a company. It excited investors. It excited journalists. It excited partners. It excited a culture hungry for a different kind of founder. It excited people who wanted healthcare to feel less cruel. All that excitement needed to be slowed down by evidence. It was not slowed enough. The ending, like many corporate endings, was quieter than the rise. Companies do not always die with one dramatic explosion. They empty. Partners leave. Employees depart. Offices become too large. The phones ring less. The news turns colder. Lawyers replace publicists. Regulators replace magazine editors. The future tense disappears. At Theranos, the end was gradual and then final. Company dissolved. The legal cases continued. The founder went to trial. The jury spoke. A sentence was imposed. Then the story moved into the archive. In that archive, the machine is silent. The promises are still audible, but only as recording. The drop of blood remains as an image. Small, bright, misused. What should we do with that image? We can treat it as scandal. We can treat it as entertainment. We can treat it as a lesson in fraud. But perhaps the most useful way is to treat it as a reminder of the dignity of proof. Proof is not glamorous. Proof is repetitive. Proof is careful. Proof often says not yet. Proof often disappoints ambition. Proof slows the story down. That is why proof matters. It protects people from the speed of other people's certainty. Elizabeth Holmes was certain. The company was certain. Investors wanted certainty. Patients were given certainty in the form of results. But certainty without proof is only performance. Medicine cannot live on performance. It has to live on truth. Now the story can settle into stillness. Imagine the office after the last people have left. A desk lamp still glows. A cardboard box sits open. Old binders are stacked inside. A glossy magazine with Holmes on the cover lies under a layer of dust. Somewhere in the background, a refrigerator hums in an empty lab. There is no stage now, no pitch meeting, no investor dinner, no television interview. Only the residue of a promise that became too large for the machine beneath it. The quiet is appropriate. It gives the story back its scale. A company rose. A founder was praised. A device failed. Patients were put at risk. Investors were deceived. The truth emerged. The law responded. The file closed. And outside the file, real laboratory workers continued their ordinary work. That ordinary work is the ending Theranos never understood. The future of medicine is not only disruption, it is maintenance, it is calibration, it is humility, it is retesting, it is admitting when a result is uncertain. It is building systems where a young employee can raise a concern and be heard. It is letting data embarrass leadership before leadership embarrasses the company. It is remembering that patients are not props in a founder's story. They are the reason the work exists. There's peace in that reminder. Not because the scandal was peaceful, because the truth, once separated from the performance, becomes simple. A blood test should be accurate. A medical claim should be proven. A patient should not be used to validate a myth. A founder should not be allowed to sell certainty that the data cannot support. The story can end there. But before it does, let the drop of blood return one final time. It is still small. It still contains information. It still represents fear, hope, diagnosis, prevention, and the private wish to know what is happening inside the body. That wish is tender. Theranos built a business around it. The wish deserved better. It deserved science that moved carefully. It deserved leaders who told the truth. It deserved investors who demanded proof before scale. It deserved partners who asked the hard questions. It deserved a company that understood that the most important part of a blood test is not the elegance of the story. It is whether the result is true. The file is quiet now. The voice that once filled rooms is no longer persuading the world. The turtleneck is no longer a costume of genius. The Edison is no longer a symbol of the future. The board has dispersed. The clinics have closed. The verdict is written. The sentence is being served. And somewhere, tonight, in a laboratory that will never appear on a magazine cover, a technician checks a sample twice because the number looks strange. That is the opposite of Theranos. Not glamour, not speed, not myth. Care. Care is slower. Care is quieter. Care does not always attract capital. But care is what makes medicine worthy of trust. Theranos forgot that. The archive remembers. And now, as the room grows darker, the lesson can rest. Do not let the beauty of a promise excuse the absence of proof. Do not let confidence silence the people closest to the work. Do not mistake prestige for validation. Do not treat patience as evidence for a story that has not been earned. And when a company says it can change medicine with one small drop of blood, listen carefully. Ask for the data. Ask who checked it. Ask what happens when the machine is wrong. Ask whether doubt is welcome in the room. Those questions are not cruel. They are the beginning of safety. Theranos did not fall because the dream was too kind. It fell because the dream was allowed to outrun the truth. The truth caught up. It always does. There is one more corridor in this story. It is the corridor between a private doubt and a public warning. Many people imagine whistleblowing as a sudden act of courage. One day someone sees a wrong thing. The next day they expose it. But inside real companies, it is rarely that clean. A doubt begins softly. A number does not match. A control fails. A supervisor gives an answer that sounds too smooth. A meeting ends before the hard question is answered. A document uses language that feels technically true but morally incomplete. The person noticing all of this may not know yet whether they are seeing a scandal or only a difficult project. They may want the company to succeed. They may admire the founder. They may like their colleagues. They may have moved cities for the job. They may be young. They may worry that more experienced people know something they do not. This is how doubt stays private. It feels smaller than the institution around it. At Theranos, doubts lived inside people before they lived inside newspapers and courtrooms. Those doubts had to cross fear. Fear of losing work. Fear of being sued. Fear of disappointing family. Fear of being wrong. Fear of becoming the person who slows down a mission everyone else calls important. The distance between seeing and speaking can be very long. That distance is part of every corporate collapse. The truth is rarely absent. It is usually trapped. Trapped in a lab notebook. Trapped in a Slack message. Trapped in a quality control report. Trapped in the memory of a meeting. Trapped in the stomach of an employee driving home after midnight, wondering whether the thing they saw is as serious as it feels. The companies that survive reality are the ones that let truth move upward before it escapes outward. Theranos did not do that well enough. It allowed the truth to become an enemy. Once truth becomes an enemy inside a company, outsiders eventually become necessary. Regulators become necessary. Reporters become necessary. Courts become necessary. That is a failure of internal correction. A healthy organization wants to be corrected while correction is still cheap. A sick organization treats correction as betrayal until correction becomes collapse. The cost difference is enormous. A corrected test can save a company. A corrected public myth can destroy it. Theranos waited until the correction had to happen in public. By then, the correction was no longer a fix. It was an autopsy. The autopsy showed layers. The technical layer. The device did not do what the public story said it could do. The operational layer. The company used workarounds, conventional machines, and processes that did not match the clean retail promise. The cultural layer. Employees were pressured, separated, and afraid. The governance layer. The board carried prestige without enough relevant scientific oversight. The investor layer. People with money accepted a story that should have demanded more proof. The media layer. Compelling founder narrative outran careful verification. Patient layer. People received medical information from a system that had not earned the trust it borrowed. Each layer mattered. Remove one, and the scandal might still have happened. Remove several, and perhaps the company would have been forced to become smaller, slower, and more honest. That is why the story is not only about one woman's deception. It is about an ecosystem arranged around belief. Ecosystems can make dangerous things feel normal. In the ecosystem around Theranos, it became normal to speak about transformation before validation. It became normal to interpret secrecy as genius. It became normal to treat famous names as evidence. It became normal to assume that a retail partnership meant the technology had been checked. It became normal to applaud a founder for certainty. Normal is powerful. When something feels normal, people stop asking why it exists. The abnormal thing at Theranos should have been obvious. A blood testing company with little transparent peer-reviewed evidence was claiming a revolution in diagnostics. Yet the surrounding story made that abnormality feel like innovation. This is the special danger of the word disruption. Disruption can mean useful change. It can mean breaking a broken system. It can mean making services cheaper, faster, and more accessible. But it can also become a permission slip. A way to dismiss caution. A way to paint experts as defenders of the past. A way to confuse skepticism with fear. In medicine, disruption must kneel before evidence. If it does not, it becomes reckless. Theranos wanted the prestige of medicine and the speed of software. It wanted trust before proof. It wanted scale before validation. It wanted the moral glow of healthcare with the narrative speed of consumer technology. That combination was explosive. It produced a company that could sound noble while acting dangerously. When the story finally broke, many people asked how so many important figures could have believed it. The answer is uncomfortable. Important people are still people. They respond to confidence. They respond to exclusivity. They respond to stories that flatter their sense of judgment. They respond to the chance to be early. They respond to founders who make the future feel private, as if only a select few are being invited inside before the rest of the world understands. Theranos offered that invitation. It made investors feel close to a secret future. The secrecy was part of the seduction. If something is secret, it can feel more valuable. If access is limited, people may confuse scarcity with truth. But truth does not become stronger because fewer people are allowed to inspect it. In science, the opposite is often true. The strongest claims survive exposure. They survive replication. They survive hostile review. They survive the bored precision of experts who do not care how beautiful the story is. Theranos avoided enough of that exposure to grow. Then exposure arrived all at once. After exposure, the company's old strengths became weaknesses. The famous board looked less like validation and more like a question. Why were there not more laboratory experts? The secrecy looked less like protection and more like concealment. The founder's certainty looked less like vision and more like performance. The Walgreens partnership looked less like progress and more like a premature expansion. The valuation looked less like proof and more like a measure of collective misjudgment. This reversal is common after a scandal. The same facts change meaning when the final truth appears. Before the fall, the board says credibility. After the fall, the board says failure of oversight. Before the fall, secrecy says innovation. After the fall, secrecy says warning sign. Before the fall, confidence says genius. After the fall, confidence says manipulation. The facts did not change. The frame changed. That is why hindsight feels so powerful. It rearranges the old evidence into a clear shape. The danger is believing the shape was always easy to see. For some people, it was. For others, the shape was obscured by hope, status, money, and fear. The purpose of retelling the story is not to congratulate ourselves for seeing it now. It is to ask what would help us see the next one earlier. The answer is not cynicism. Cynicism says nothing is true. That is not useful. Real innovation exists. Real founders solve real problems. Real medical devices improve lives. Real laboratories create better tests. The answer is disciplined trust. Trust that asks for evidence. Trust that respects expertise. Trust that grows as proof grows. Trust that does not skip the boring work. Trust that understands the difference between a mission and a result. A mission tells us why the work matters. A result tells us whether the work is working. Theranos had a mission that mattered. It did not have results that matched the mission. That gap became the scandal. There is also a warning here for creators of stories. Writers, journalists, investors, and audiences all love a clean protagonist. A 19-year-old Stanford dropout afraid of needles who wants to make blood testing painless. That is a clean story. It is almost too clean. Clean stories should make us careful. Life is usually messier than the story that sells. Science is messier. Startups are messier. Medicine is messier. When a story is perfect, the evidence must be even stronger. Theranos gave the world a perfect story and insufficient evidence. The world accepted the story first. That is the order we have to learn from. Now imagine the patient again. Not the investor, not the journalist, not the board member. A patient. Someone who does not care about venture capital. Someone who does not care about startup mythology. Someone who only wants to know whether a number means they are safe, sick, improving, or in danger. That person is the final judge of the moral seriousness of the company. A diagnostic company should be built backward from that person. Not from the stage, not from the magazine cover, not from the valuation, from the patient reading the result. If that result is wrong, everything upstream has failed. If that result is reliable, the work has dignity even if no one applauds. Theranos chased applause before it had earned reliability. That is the quiet sentence at the center of the file. And perhaps that is why the story still feels alive. It is not only about the past. It is about every moment when speed tempts us away from care. Every moment when the story is so attractive that the proof feels rude. Every moment when a powerful person speaks with such certainty that the room forgets to ask for the data. Every moment when a company says, "Trust us," and the right answer is not distrust, but show us. Show us the validation. Show us the limitations. Show us the failures. Show us who checked. Show us who can disagree. Show us what happens when the machine is wrong. These questions are not enemies of innovation. They are what allow innovation to become medicine. Without them, A breakthrough remains only a performance. And performance, no matter how convincing, cannot heal anyone. The night around this story is quiet now. The public noise has faded. The headlines have slowed. The verdict is no longer breaking news. The company has become a case study. Case studies are strange things. They flatten life into lessons. They make timelines neat. They turn fear, ambition, pride, confusion, and betrayal into bullet points on a slide. But behind the case study was lived time. Years of work. Years of belief. Years of silence. Years of pressure. Years in which the machine did not become the miracle the world had been promised. Those years matter. They remind us that collapses are not only events, they are durations. They are long periods when the truth and the story travel side by side, with the story moving faster. At Theranos, the story moved faster until it could not move anymore. Then the truth arrived at the finish line with documents in its hands. That image can stay with us. Truth, slower, but carrying records. Not glamorous, not loud, not styled for a cover photo, but patient. Theranos was impatient. It wanted the end of the story before the middle had been proven. It wanted the world changed before the test worked at scale. It wanted to be celebrated as a revolution before it had endured the discipline of reality. The discipline of reality is unkind to falsehood. It is kind to patience. That is why we need it. So in the last room of this file, the lights dim again. The rain taps against a window. A desk lamp glows over old papers. The company name sits on a folder now, not a building. Theranos. A name once built from therapy and diagnosis. A name that promised relief and certainty. A name that became a warning. The folder is heavy because it contains more than a failed startup. It contains a lesson about proof, a lesson about charisma, a lesson about medicine, a lesson about how a beautiful idea can become dangerous when protected from reality. The folder can close now, but the lesson should not. It should stay slightly open. Open enough for the next founder. Open enough for the next investor. Open enough for the next journalist. Open enough for the next patient being told that the future has arrived. The future may arrive. Sometimes it does. But in medicine, the future must bring data with it. No data, no miracle. No validation, no trust. No accuracy. No healthcare. Only a story. And stories, however beautiful, are not enough when someone is waiting for a blood test result. Before the room becomes completely quiet, there is another part of the file worth opening. It is not the loudest part. It is not the trial. It is not the magazine cover. It is the slow middle of the story, where a company still has time to become honest, but chooses instead to become more convincing. That is the part where many collapses are truly made. The beginning is often clean. The end is often obvious. The middle is where the danger learns how to survive. Theranos lived for years in that middle. It lived between promise and proof. It lived between what Elizabeth Holmes said the machine could do and what the machine actually did. It lived between a beautiful mission and a laboratory reality that kept refusing to obey the story. The company did not collapse the first time an engineer saw a problem. It did not collapse the first time a test failed. It did not collapse the first time an employee questioned the data. It survived all of those moments. That survival is important. A false story does not become powerful only because one person tells it. It becomes powerful because other people adjust themselves around it. They stop asking certain questions. They soften certain warnings. They explain away certain contradictions. They tell themselves that every startup is messy, that every invention fails before it works, that every visionary founder sounds unreasonable until the world catches up. Sometimes that is true. Sometimes a strange idea really is early. Sometimes the first prototype really is crude. Sometimes the world really does laugh before it understands. But medicine is not software. A broken app can be patched. A failed feature can be rolled back. A wrong blood result enters a human life. That distinction should have changed everything. At Theranos, it did not change enough. The company borrowed the language of Silicon Valley and carried it into healthcare. Move fast, think bigger, disrupt the old system, ignore the doubters. Build the future before the experts believe it is possible. Those words can sound inspiring in a software company. They can sound reckless in a clinical laboratory. A laboratory is not a place for theatrical certainty. It is a place for repetition. It is a place for calibration. It is a place where the boring answer is often the correct one. It is a place where doubt is not betrayal. Doubt is quality control. A good scientist does not hate uncertainty. A good scientist uses uncertainty as a map. They ask where the result might be wrong. They ask how large the error margin is. They ask whether the sample was handled correctly. They ask whether another machine gives the same result. They ask whether the result can be repeated tomorrow by someone else in a different room without the founder watching. Theranos struggled with that kind of humility. It wanted the conclusion before the evidence. It wanted the world to accept the story while the machine was still failing privately. That is why the middle years matter. During those years, the company had chances to slow down. It could have narrowed the promise. It could have said the device was experimental. It could have said it could run only a small number of tests. It could have waited before putting patients into the system. It could have invited more outside scientists into the room. It could have published meaningful validation data. It could have let the truth be smaller than the dream. Instead, the dream stayed large. The machine stayed uncertain, and the gap between them filled with pressure. Pressure came from investors. Pressure came from partnerships. Pressure came from the media story. Pressure came from Elizabeth Holmes herself. The company had been built around a central promise. One drop, hundreds of tests, fast results, low cost, a painless future. If that promise became smaller, the myth would become smaller too. And Theranos was not being valued like a cautious laboratory company. It was being valued like a revolution. Revolutions do not like footnotes. They do not like delays. They do not like someone saying not yet. But medicine is made of not yet. Not yet proven, not yet validated, not yet safe, not yet ready. Those words protect patients. They can sound disappointing to investors. They can sound weak to founders. But in healthcare, they are often the most ethical words in the room. At Theranos, those words had very little power. The stronger words were future, access, disruption, and mission. The mission was emotionally powerful. That is another reason the story lasted. It did not promise a trivial improvement. It promised something people genuinely wanted. A world where blood tests were cheaper. A world where people could catch disease earlier. A world where a mother, a father, a child, or a patient in a rural town could receive information quickly and without fear. That world is not foolish. It is humane. It is worth building. But a humane goal can still be used to excuse inhumane shortcuts. A beautiful mission does not validate a broken test. A noble purpose does not make a number accurate. This is one of the quiet traps of Theranos. The story felt morally good. Because it felt morally good, people became more willing to treat doubt as obstruction. If someone questioned the machine, they were not simply questioning an instrument. They were questioning access. They were questioning innovation. They were questioning the dream of better healthcare. That framing made skepticism feel cruel. But skepticism was exactly what patients needed. The patients did not need a dream. They needed a result they could trust. To understand how the company moved from private failure to public harm, we have to look at the partnerships. Partnerships gave Theranos credibility. Walgreens was not a small symbol. It was a national pharmacy chain. It was familiar to ordinary people. A person might distrust a startup they had never heard of. But if the startup appeared inside a known pharmacy, under bright lights, with forms and counters and staff, the trust changed. The setting did some of the persuasion. The pharmacy said, "This is real." The partnership said, "Someone has checked." The storefront said, "You are safe." That is why the Walgreens deal mattered so much. It translated Theranos from a Silicon Valley story into a consumer healthcare experience. People could walk in. People could participate. People could place their bodies inside the promise. This is where the story becomes heavier. Investors risk money. Patients risk decisions. A wrong investor deck can destroy capital. A wrong medical result can disturb a life. It can lead to fear. It can lead to delay. It can lead to unnecessary procedures. It can lead to the wrong conversation with a doctor. It can lead to nights of waiting with a number that should not have been trusted. Theranos crossed that line. It stopped being only a private company chasing a valuation. It became a public healthcare provider sending results into the world. Once that happened, the margin for error became much smaller. The ethical burden became much larger. The company did not meet that burden. The Safeway story belongs here too. Safeway had prepared spaces inside its stores for Theranos testing. It had invested heavily in the partnership. It imagined a future where grocery shopping and medical testing could live under the same roof. That idea, like many parts of Theranos, was not absurd on its face. Convenient healthcare is appealing. Preventive testing is appealing. Bringing services closer to ordinary life is appealing. But the appealing surface again covered the same question. Does the technology work? Not does the store look good. Not does the founder sound convincing. Not does the business model scale. Does the technology work? For Theranos, that question kept returning. It returned inside the laboratory. It returned in employee concerns. It returned in patient complaints. It returned in regulator inspections. It returned in journalism. It returned in court. A company can avoid a question for a while. It cannot avoid the same question forever. The question becomes louder each time it returns. Inside Theranos, secrecy made the question harder to answer honestly. Secrecy can protect legitimate intellectual property. A medical technology company has reasons to guard designs and methods, but secrecy can also protect failure. It can keep employees isolated. It can prevent experts from seeing enough. It can stop small doubts from becoming collective knowledge. It can make every person feel alone with what they know. Theranos used secrecy intensely. Departments were separated. Employees were monitored. Legal threats followed people after they left. The company behaved as if information itself was dangerous. In a real sense, it was. Information was dangerous because the truth was dangerous to the valuation. This created a strange inversion. In medicine, transparency protects the patient. At Theranos, secrecy protected the company. Those two priorities collided. When they collided, the company chose itself. That choice is the heart of many corporate scandals. A moment comes when leadership must decide whether to protect the people outside the company or protect the story inside it. Theranos chose the story too many times. It chose the story with investors. It chose the story with partners. It chose the story with patients. It chose the story with the media. And each choice made the next correction harder. The deeper a company goes into a false story, the more expensive honesty becomes. Early honesty can be painful. Late honesty can be fatal. Theranos waited too long. At the time John Carreyrou began reporting, the story had become enormous. It had accumulated money, partnerships, reputations, magazine covers, speeches, and public identity. A small correction would not be enough. The whole myth had to be confronted. That is why the reporting matters. Journalism entered where internal controls had failed. A reporter began doing what many powerful people had not done with enough force. He asked the simple questions again and again. Who says the device works? Where is the evidence? How many tests are actually run on the Edison? What do former employees say? What do patients say? What do regulators know? The company responded not with transparency, but with pressure. Lawyers were involved. Sources were afraid. Former employees had to decide whether speaking was worth the risk. That fear tells us something. A healthy company with strong data can answer a reporter with data. A fragile company often answers with intimidation. Theranos tried to hold the wall. The Wall Street Journal reporting put cracks through it. Once the first story appeared, the myth became harder to maintain. Not impossible. Holmes still went on television. She still spoke with certainty. She still framed criticism as the price of changing the world. That frame had worked before. This time, the frame was weaker, because now the questions were specific. Specific questions are dangerous to vague confidence. A founder can defeat vague doubt with vision. Specific evidence requires a different answer. Theranos did not have a good enough one. Regulators then entered the story with a different kind of language. They did not care about magazine covers. They did not care about founder mythology. They cared about procedures, controls, accuracy, quality systems, laboratory standards, documentation. Their language was dry. That dryness was powerful. It removed the romance. It brought the company back to the basic world of clinical testing. In that world, a test either meets standards or it does not. A laboratory either protects accuracy or it does not. Patients either receive trustworthy results or they do not. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services found serious deficiencies. That sentence does not sound cinematic. It sounds administrative. But in the Theranos story, it is devastating. The administrative language did what years of public praise had not done. It forced the story back into the realm of proof. The company had to void years of test results. Think about the weight of that. Not a product recall from a shelf. Not a software bug fixed overnight. Blood test results. Medical information already sent into the world. Numbers that had already moved through doctor visits, family conversations, patient fear, and clinical judgment. To void them was to say the past could not be trusted, but patients had already lived inside that past. They had already reacted. They had already worried. They had already made decisions. The correction came after the human experience. This is why healthcare fraud has a different texture than many business frauds. The product touches the body. It touches vulnerability. It touches the private fear people feel when they wait for results. Money can be lost and sometimes earned again. Trust in a medical result, once damaged, leaves a deeper mark. The legal system eventually separated investor harm and patient harm in its own technical ways. The jury would convict Holmes on investor-related counts and not on patient-related counts. That legal distinction matters in court. But morally, the patient story remains central. Because the promise of Theranos was not primarily a financial product. It was a medical promise. It was a promise made to people who wanted to understand their own bodies. That promise carried a duty. The duty was not fulfilled. The trial years later brought the private world of Theranos into public sequence. Witnesses described pressure. They described limitations. They described the gap between claim and reality. The courtroom turned memory into testimony. It placed sentences under oath. That is another way a company loses control of its story. Inside the company, language can be managed. In court, language is examined. A founder can no longer rely on the rhythm of a keynote. There are questions, there are exhibits, there are emails, there are former employees, there are patients. There are investors who explain what they believed and why they believed it. The trial did not recreate every moment. No trial can. But it exposed enough of the machinery to show the pattern. Claims were made. Evidence lagged. Money flowed. Warnings were ignored. The company defended the story until the story collapsed. When Holmes testified, the story became more complicated in public. She described pressure from Ramesh Bhawani. She described a relationship that affected her life and judgment. The defense presented a more human and damaged founder than the magazine covers had shown. That testimony mattered. It reminded listeners that corporate scandals are lived by human beings, not symbols. But human complexity does not erase the facts of what was told to investors and patients. A person can be complicated and still responsible. A founder can be under pressure and still make false claims. A dream can be sincere and still become fraud. The verdict separated the sympathy from the evidence. Guilty. Not on every count, not on every theory, but guilty enough to end the last version of the myth. The sentencing placed a number on the consequence. 11 years and 3 months. That number is now part of the file. It sits beside other numbers. 19 years old, $9 billion, more than 900 million raised, 2 years voided test results. A company gone, sentence imposed. Business history is made from numbers like these. But the numbers do not breathe. The breathing belongs to the people who waited for the results, who worked in the labs, who raised concerns, who invested savings, who signed contracts, who believed, who doubted, who spoke, who stayed quiet. That is why the story must be told slowly. If it is told too quickly, it becomes a headline. Founder lies. Company fails. Prison sentence. That is not enough. The deeper lesson is in the slow conversion of belief into harm. The deeper lesson is in how a mission can become armor. The deeper lesson is in how respected people can lend credibility to something they do not understand. The deeper lesson is in how secrecy can make an organization feel powerful while making it less safe. The deeper lesson is in how medicine demands humility from anyone who touches it. Theranos did not have enough humility. That is the quiet sentence beneath the whole file. It had ambition. It had money. It had famous names. It had media attention. It had a founder who could hold a room still. It had a mission that sounded morally urgent. It had everything except the thing that mattered most. A working test proven clearly before patients were asked to trust it. Everything else was decoration. The turtleneck was decoration. The board was decoration. The magazine covers were decoration. The valuation was decoration. The voice was decoration. In healthcare, the test is the truth. The truth was not there. When we place Theranos next to other corporate collapses, it occupies a special room in the archive. Enron was about energy, accounting, and the conversion of complexity into false confidence. Theranos was about medicine, charisma, and the conversion of hope into false confidence. Both stories used complexity. Both stories used prestige. Both stories punished doubt. Both stories depended on people believing that someone else had checked. Both stories ended with the same cold discovery. The check had not been enough. This is why Collapse Files begins with these stories. They are different on the surface. Pipelines and blood. Trading floors and laboratories. Houston and Palo Alto. Accounting statements and test results. But underneath, the same pattern moves. A company becomes a myth. The myth becomes a valuation. The valuation becomes protection. Protection becomes pressure. Pressure becomes concealment. Concealment becomes collapse. Theranos followed that pattern with a white laboratory coat over it. That made it feel cleaner. It was not cleaner, it was only quieter. The story is quiet now too. The offices are gone. The wellness centers are gone. The device is gone. The public events are over. The trial has ended. The sentence is being served. The company no longer asks anyone to believe, but the desire that built it still exists. People still want healthcare to be easier. They still want earlier detection. They still want less pain. They still want lower cost. They still want the future Elizabeth Holmes described. That is the hardest part. The dream was not wrong. The claim was. There is a difference between a dream and a device. A dream can be stated in a sentence. A device must survive the laboratory. A dream can inspire investors. A device must produce accurate results. A dream can live on a stage. A device must work in a clinic on a Tuesday morning for a patient whose doctor will trust the number. Theranos confused the power of the dream with the readiness of the device. That confusion made the company valuable. Then it made the company dangerous. Then it made the company disappear. So the file becomes simple again. Not because the facts are simple, because the lesson is. In medicine, proof comes before scale. Validation comes before marketing. Accuracy comes before access. Patients come before valuation. Truth comes before story. If those things are reversed, the company may still grow. It may raise money. It may attract famous names. It may appear on magazine covers. It may open stores. It may become a symbol of the future. But the reversal remains inside it. And one day, the inside becomes visible. At Theranos, the inside became visible through employees, journalists, regulators, patients, prosecutors, and the slow machinery of law. It became visible because the facts had been there all along. They only needed a path into the light. The light was not dramatic at first. A tip, a phone call, a question, a laboratory inspection, a patient complaint, a document, a witness. That is how many truths arrive. Not as lightning, as accumulation. One small fact beside another. One voice beside another. One inconsistency beside another. Eventually, the shape appears. And once the shape appears, the old story cannot cover it. This is where the listener can rest, because the dangerous part is over. The machine is off. The file is open only in memory. The rain is outside the window. The documents are still. The lesson is not asking for panic. It is asking for attention. Quiet attention. The kind that notices when a founder speaks too beautifully about something that should be measured. The kind that notices when a board has famous names but not the right expertise. The kind that notices when a company says, "Trust us," but does not show the data. The kind that notices when secrecy stops protecting invention and starts protecting illusion. That kind of attention is not cynical. It is protective. It protects patients. It protects employees. It protects investors. It protects the future from people who want to sell it before they have built it. And perhaps that is the gentlest way to understand the scandal now. Theranos was not only a story about deception. It was a story about premature certainty. A future was announced before it was earned. A revolution was marketed before it was validated. A founder became a symbol before the science became real. The symbol rose quickly. The science did not follow. Then the symbol fell. The fall was public. The lesson is private. It belongs to any room where someone is tempted to say the evidence will catch up later. It belongs to any founder who believes doubt is weakness. It belongs to any investor who feels flattered by access. It belongs to any board member impressed by proximity to genius. It belongs to any patient asked to trust a number. The number must be true. That is the whole matter. The number must be true. Not inspiring, not disruptive, not elegant. True. And if it is not true, the story around it does not matter. The story only makes the untruth travel farther. Now the file is heavier than before. It contains the original promise. It contains the voice. It contains the laboratory. It contains the boardroom. It contains Walgreens. It contains Safeway. It contains the reporting. It contains the inspections. It contains the patients. It contains the trial. It contains the sentence. It contains the quiet work of real laboratories continuing after the myth is gone. And it contains the final difference between invention and performance. Invention survives testing. Performance survives attention only for a while. Elizabeth Holmes performed the future. The future did not arrive. What arrived was the record. And records are less glamorous than dreams, but they are more faithful. They remember what was promised. They remember what was proven. They remember the distance between the two. That distance is where Theranos lives now. Not in the future of medicine, in the archive of caution. A warning filed under ambition. A warning filed under charisma. A warning filed under healthcare. A warning filed under the danger of believing that certainty can substitute for science. The warning is not loud. It does not need to be. It only needs to remain. There is one more corridor in the Theranos building. It is the corridor between admiration and responsibility. Every admired company eventually walks there. At first, admiration feels like wind at the back. It helps the company hire. It helps the company raise money. It helps the founder enter rooms that would otherwise stay closed. It makes journalists curious. It makes partners patient. It makes employees believe their exhaustion has meaning. Admiration can be useful, but admiration also creates a soft pressure to remain admirable. The company begins to protect the version of itself that the outside world likes. The founder begins to answer not only to the facts, but to the myth. The myth wants clean lines. The facts are messy. The myth wants a hero. The laboratory wants repeatable results. The myth wants a moment when everything changes. Science wants years of slow work. Theranos chose the myth too often. It chose the clean line over the messy truth. It chose the hero story over the laboratory result. It chose the appearance of inevitability over the discipline of proof. This is why the company became so compelling from the outside and so dangerous from the inside. From the outside, it looked like a breakthrough. From the inside, it looked like a demand. Make the promise real. Make the machine work. Make the results match the speech. Make the future arrive on schedule. But science does not respond to schedules in that way. Chemistry does not care about investor meetings. Biology does not care about media profiles. A sample either contains enough usable material or it does not. A device either measures accurately or it does not. A validation study either supports the claim or it does not. The physical world is indifferent to prestige. That indifference is what finally defeated Theranos. Not a rival founder, not a jealous scientist, not a skeptical journalist alone. Final opponent was reality itself. Reality had been present the entire time. It was present in the small blood samples that did not behave like the story needed them to behave. It was present in the engineer's concerns. It was present in the laboratory comparisons. It was present in patient results that did not make sense. It was present in the silence after someone asked for evidence. Reality was not dramatic. It was patient. That patience makes these stories feel almost inevitable after they end. But inevitability is misleading. There were exits. There were moments when the company could have stopped and told a smaller truth. A smaller truth might have saved something. It might have saved the research. It might have saved the employees from years of fear. It might have saved patients from false confidence. It might have saved investors from larger losses. It might have saved the founder from becoming the face of a fraud trial. But smaller truth requires surrender. It requires saying the world we promised is not here yet. It requires accepting that the valuation may fall. It requires disappointing people who believed. It requires letting the myth die before it can destroy the company. Theranos did not surrender soon enough. So the surrender came later, imposed from outside. It came through regulators. It came through journalism. It came through criminal charges. It came through the verdict. That is another lesson in the file. A truth spoken early can feel like failure. A truth forced late can become ruin. The difference is time. Time gave Theranos many chances. Time also made the consequences larger. Each month of delay added more people, more money, more claims, more promises, more patience, more documents, and more fear of stopping. This is how false stories gain momentum. They do not only move forward because someone pushes them. They move forward because stopping becomes too expensive. The company keeps walking because the alternative feels unbearable. Then one day, continuing becomes impossible. That day is remembered as the collapse, but the collapse is only the day the world sees the weight. The weight was gathered long before. Theranos gathered it in quiet rooms. It gathered it in investor meetings. It gathered it in laboratory decisions. It gathered it in partnership announcements. It gathered it in legal threats. It gathered it in every moment when the company chose to defend the story instead of correct it. When the weight finally fell, it crushed the myth quickly. The real laboratories of the world continued. They did not stop when Theranos disappeared. They kept doing what they had always done: measuring, checking, repeating, documenting, rejecting results that did not meet standards. That quiet continuity is important. It reminds us that the scandal was not proof that medical testing is broken. It was proof that medical testing must not be replaced by theater. The ordinary laboratory, with its protocols and cautious people and unglamorous machines, was not the enemy of progress. It was the thing progress had to respect. Theranos wanted to leap over that world. The leap failed. The ground remained. And on that ground, real science continues. Not always elegantly, not always quickly, but carefully enough to deserve trust. That trust is the final subject of the story. Trust is not built from charisma. Trust is not built from famous names. Trust is not built from secrecy. Trust is built when a claim survives contact with evidence. Theranos claimed too much and proved too little. Everything else follows from that. The rest is scenery. The voice, the black turtleneck, the boardroom, the valuation, the headlines, the partnerships, the trial. All of it surrounds the same simple center. A test must be true. A company said it was. It was not. The file can close with that, not as anger, as clarity. The clarity is enough. The room is still. The file is quiet. The warning remains.